All right, so let me welcome everyone and we'll get started, though I suspect additional people will join us in the first few minutes here. But excited to kick off the second webinar conversation that we have scheduled. The meta theme of these four webinar conversations is really looking at how do we increase our expressive capacity to have the conversations we need to have in order to create the thriving world that we want to live in. And this is occurring in the context of impact and social impact, positive impact, and is taking the vantage point that impact's a very important concept and topic. It's gaining a lot more traction in the business world, and yet we need to expand kind of the distinctions that we work with in order to understand impact and measure impact and to work with impact. And so here at MetaIntegral, we've been developing a framework called the MetaImpact framework that we feel provides some really powerful distinctions that allow us to have some really important conversations. And so there's four key components to that framework. And so each of the four conversations is devoted to one of those aspects of the framework. And tonight, which is our second conversation, we're going to be talking about multiple forms of capital. And so the theme tonight is really moving from dysfunctional monocapitalism, which is our current system, to thriving multicapitalism. And it's a very exciting concept and topic because over the last 10 years, we've seen a number of new models emerge that are putting forth different types of capital. And what does that mean and how do they do that is going to be a big part of our focus tonight. So I'm Sean Aspierenhargens, the founder of MetaIntegral, and I'm joined by my core team, Shanti Gaya and Claudia Meglin. So good to have both of them with us and to see some familiar faces. Welcome everyone. We've kicked off this series of these four conversations in large part because we have a number of things that we're offering over the next year. We have a new master course occurring in February. We just launched our 5-day seminar in Australia, which is a follow-up to the one we did in Iceland this last April. And so we're using this webinar to kind of build some momentum and some engagement around these topics so that as we move into those other offerings later in the year, that we have just built up some additional, kind of ways of thinking about these key topics. So great to have all of you. And why don't I go ahead and turn it over to you, Claudia, to just frame up a few kind of key elements that we might consider as we launch into the conversation tonight. There you go.
Hey. Yeah, so hello, welcome everybody. And so this is a really exciting conversation. And so this day today, we want to really exploring how many capitals are there and which one should I use, and what is actually a multicapitalism. And so while we are sitting really in a larger conversation here, I just want to mention some of the things that are going on right now, and maybe we can hinge on them. So, so there are definitely global trends that are, and passions that are growing everywhere to include multiple capitals, from triple bottom line up to the UN sustainability goals. So there's almost like a explosion of multi-capitals. Sean has done a very intense search for finding meta patterns around all these capitals. And if you participate in one of our deeper courses, you will learn more of this. But in our research that Sean facilitated, so 10 of them really were standing out. And so we see them really as a form of an accordion, like the instrument accordion. So where kind of they're all connected and unfolding. And that's also one of the questions right now. How do we really find this endpoint of moving from our single capital into like a multi-capital movement? And that is complex in our already complex systems. And the other piece that we want to bring into this conversation is integrated report, the whole integrated reporting conversation. So the International Integrated Reporting Council, with the short of IIRC, has 6 different capitals. They're identifying financial, manufactured, intellectual, human, social, and relationships, and natural. But they're all really looking at the exterior measurement. None of them are really looking at the interior measurement of these capitals. And the other piece that I want to mention is that why we're talking about capital, and that has been an ongoing conversation internally and as also in our courses, is the notion of what does it actually mean, capital. Usually when we're thinking about capital, we're thinking about financial capital. And there is already like an in point in our conversation around multi-capitals and how we're moving from our monocapitalism into multi-capital system, may it be whatever form it takes, to really maybe think as a starting point what capital means. And so with this kind of, I hope that I launched us into a little bit of a framework here. And so the microphone is open now. Sean, do you want to give another pointer or just bring it out?
Yeah, thank you, Claudia. Yeah, in a few minutes, I'll do my screen share to show you the 10 capitals, just so people are clear on kind of what those are. But I think before we do that, it'd be great to hear some of your voices and just to get a sense of what are people's experiences with working with additional types of capital besides financial capital. You know, have people, you know, use different models or have familiarity with working with social capital or human capital or natural capital? Because it'd be nice just to get a sense of ways in which some of you are already, you know, exploring the different types of capital and finding the value of moving from an approach to monocapitalism, which is just exclusively on financial, to, you know, different types of triple bottom line approaches that include, you know, more than one type of capital. So why don't we hear from a few folks, and then we can do some screen sharing to just kind of deepen our understanding around what are some of these different types of capital. So anyone want to, yeah, Mary?
Yeah, thanks. Well, I mean, obviously, because I have a feeling of being so connected to the land, a big piece here is seed banking, soil banking, and then also caring for the watershed, the food shed, and the atmosphere, which is extremely difficult here on the Front Range with all the fracking that's going on. But people are very active in wanting to work with those forms of natural capital here. Yeah. And then one other thing that I've noted, interestingly, and it relates a bit to what you're creating here, of all of the transformative organizations that I'm involved with, the focus really is a lot on community building. So that relationship piece. Yeah. So people aren't as much interested in for example, a weekend workshop as getting engaged with a community of practice of any kind of transformative practice. So there's that aspect as well that's been emerging for me in my noticings recently. Thank you.
Yeah, great, thank you. And it's so perfect that you are sharing about natural capitalism, because natural capital is one of the more developed forms of capital besides financial capital. And we have the whole environmental movement, sustainability movement over the last, you know, 30, 40, 50 years to really thank for, you know, really operationalizing the notion of natural capital. One of the things we do with that is we try and move the discussion of natural capital beyond just what we would call the third person aspects of natural capital. Because, and also including the second person and the first person, so the subjective and intersubjective aspects of natural capital. Whereas, you know, in order for sustainability to really get natural capital on the table, they've had to really emphasize the objective and interobjective dimensions of that, which is very notable and makes a lot of sense. But now I think we're at a point where we can expand our understanding of natural capital, include these other layers of it. In our third conversation, in about a month, we'll be focusing on the 3 types of data, which are the first person, second person, and third person. But so just appreciating you kind of kicking us off with that, as well as the social and cultural capital. All right, who else would like to, Holly?
Yeah, I'm curious to understand what you mean by manufactured capital. I've worked a large part of my career in the manufacturing sector and was just, the other day thinking that if there was a financial collapse, that my friends that, for instance, have a stamping facility and they have a lot of steel, that would be capital because if we didn't have money, they still have steel that they can make into things and they still have machines to make things with. So, but I don't know what you meant by it, so I'm curious.
Yeah, no, you're right on target. That's the word that's used in the literature to refer to essentially that which you own, right? So it's essentially assets. So like buildings, property, land, the inventory, right? So things that have been manufactured, equipment, it's kind of all those things that we think of in terms of kind of buildings and the things inside the buildings or the land that the buildings are on. And so it's one of the older forms of capital in terms of a kind of capital that's been acknowledged and included, because a lot of those forms of capital, it's easy to put them on the balance sheet in terms of if you have a certain amount of inventory or stock, you can kind of price that out. If you have land or property, you can price that out, right? So a lot of manufactured capital kind of lends itself well to kind of, a form of financial capital in a sense, though. When we get into the first and second person aspects of it, it expands that concept more, but that's essentially what it's referring to. All right, who else? Other comments? Yeah, Philip? There we go.
I just spent 3 days at a social impact forum, which was, and here in
the
Toronto.
Bay Area?
No, this is in Toronto, actually.
Oh, wow, okay.
And there were a lot of government employees there, and it just gave me an idea that maybe there's. I'm not too sure where you put the category of capital in terms of power or government influence, or I guess they would call in a category of power of some sort.
Yeah, this is a great question. And there's a couple ways that we include that aspect in the meta-capital framework. Often it's included in like social capital. So like connections, reputation, kind of linkages, strategic partnerships. It also can be included in cultural capital in terms of the sense of connection, within a community, the sense of empowerment. So there's certain capitals that lend themselves towards the inclusion of kind of power, influence, participatory engagement. And then within each kind of capital, there's the second person dimension, the intersubjective dimension. And so that participatory aspect then brings, that into all 10 of them. So like in financial capital, for us, the second person aspect of financial capital would be like co-budgeting, right? So a distribution of participation and engagement around financial capital and the budgeting, and distribution of funds, right? And so there's a similar way in which the other forms of capital can have a participatory dimension to it that would be included in that second person aspect of each capital. But a lot of the government elements that you were kind of pointing to in terms of social capital are usually thought of in terms of social or sometimes cultural capital. Right. All right. How about a few more comments or reflections, and then I'll share with you kind of the pinwheel colorful model that we have, and just say a little bit about each of the 10 types of capital.
So I'm Bobby. I'm also up here in Canada. I'm in Atlanta, Canada. And so I'm an EQ coach and also a tech COO. So as much as my company is still going in the team coaching end of things, there's one part where, once we do enough of the kind of trust building and figure out what's actually going on, there's different kind of directions to get a sense of, okay, where are you at now and where do you want to go to? And particularly if it's in the efficiency end of things, try to push them towards these sorts of models. So we want better ways to, what it feels more like is, because I feel like particularly when you're dealing with executive teams, because they need things not just visible, but like quantified and measurable in some way. Part of it is just making this kind of visible and clear and trackable to them, that it can grab their attention and they can measure it. And so not just broadly saying, talking about people and planet, but like a bunch of KPIs they can track, right? And it is particularly that, as much as that fits initially in kind of one of the 4 kind of quadrant directions they want to move, which is about efficiency, we're trying to see if we can find ways that this can blend in kind of all the directions, so regardless of whether it's more about motivation or more about kind of strategy change or whatever they have to do. So I'm still exploring to see how that's possible, because I want to make sure that we're addressing kind of short-term needs, but we're illuminating them to kind of what's possible. They feel this is endless. So particularly if you think of, let's say, B Corp status, right? I mean, yes, it's sustainability stuff, but really what it kind of is organizationally is like this 2-year certification that's about process improvement, really, except for it's a very wide scope of all the processes you're improving and all these different impact areas. And so trying to get organization to buy into it's like, you should be paying attention to these things, and these are measurable and trackable, is like a giant shift in terms of the kind of the biz int they're used to kind of taking in.
Yeah, and absolutely. I mean, what you're highlighting is really right on track with so much of what we're dealing with and exploring. And, this idea of visibility is really key for us, because with the model we're using, we really shift from a focus on objectivity to a focus on visibility, because there are strategies that we use that can turn subjective realities and intersubjective realities and make those visible. And because visibility has a quasi-objective kind of quality to it, in that you can see it, right? And so in a sense, it can be shared awareness around that data, around that reality. And so by highlighting visibility, and that allows us to then track it, right? And so this is one way of helping to soften kind of more mainstream approaches that are really dead set on quantitative measurement and kind of more old school, positivistic ways of tracking stuff. So by getting them to shift to highlighting visibility, it gives a little more breathing room to include some of the qualitative elements that are really crucial for actually measuring impact. But the model is really set up to meet people where they're at. And one of the great things about it, when we look at it in a moment, I'll highlight that around the outside are all the 3rd-person approaches to that capital. So you can include all 10 capitals strictly in a quantitative way, right? And then that allows everyone to stay in their comfort zone, right? It's like we're not expecting or asking anyone to go beyond that if they don't want to or they're not ready to do that, right? But generally, when you work with an organization, you find out that there actually are measuring and including a lot of qualitative aspects of what they're doing. But by highlighting that the model includes quantitative in all 10 forms of capital, it can allow them to relax a little bit, and then you can find skillful ways to start to introduce them to some of the softer aspects, the interior aspects, the qualitative aspects. And one of the best ways to do that is by emphasizing the visibility of that, right? So by making those realities visible, right? And so self-report, like you can ask people after a meeting, what was your experience of the meeting? Was this an effective meeting, a useful meeting? Was it worth your time? Right? So people can give subjective and intersubjective reports about their experience of that meeting, and that then becomes visible, right? And then you can use the visibility of that to then change the structure of the meeting, change the focus, right? And so that's just an example. And I think I actually gave a version of that in the last conversation that allows people to start to see how you can work with subjective data and intersubjective data, but still have it be visible, right? And that the visibility is actually more important than whether it's objective or not, right? Because then it allows you to start to work with it and incorporate it. Similarly with KPIs, right? We've been developing a model where we use KPI to not just refer to key performance indicators, which would be, in our kind of model, would be clear impact in terms of behavior. But there's also like key process indicators, which is more the systems approach, which would be in the high impact, right? And there's key partnership indicators, which would be in the lower left or in the deep impact, right? And so we play with the notion of KPI because KPI is so entrenched in all approaches to measurement of impact. that we feel like, well, why don't we just work with that acronym KPI, but let's just change the P a little bit, to either be performance or partnership or process as a way of further differentiating the space. So as per kind of the meta theme of these conversations, we can have more expressive capacity to actually have the right conversations around impact. So I think this issue, and in the next conversation, when we go more into the first, second, and third person types of data, we'll go more into this issue around the quantitative and the qualitative. Great. All right, one more comment, and then I'll throw the diagram up and make a couple more points about that. Yeah, Brian.
Listening to you all to this point, I kind of feel as though my socioeconomic context may not be as progressive as some of the rest of yours. And that's a bit speculative on my part. But what I find myself kind of wrestling with more basically perhaps is a theme that had presented it, and I've been almost ruminating on for an extended time. That is why do our best efforts produce and generate outcomes that we wouldn't desire? And seeing that kind of within my own locality, those patterns apparently, kind of presenting themselves, reiterating themselves over and over again, which especially in collective work becomes so disheartening as to constitute almost burnout. It becomes threatening to the whatever operating system that, or ecosystem that you've generated or formed to that, to a point in time, and that's a reflection of where I'm currently finding myself. I think, Sean, what you were just saying about making visible, whether it's a narrative or whatever form, kind of practical form that it takes, along the lines of speaking truth to power. That's kind of my assignment, seemingly at the moment. I'm having trouble. It seems over the last year that something has occurred and kind of disrupted the work and the position and the standing that I've had within the community. And for the life of me, I'm having great deal of difficulty putting my finger on it, but in a position so kind of intimidated and threatened by it, of having to address it nevertheless, which is calling upon basically what integral skill set I've developed to this point, to not be reactionary, but to continue in advocacy, and as an advocate, basically for the health and well-being of the community as a whole.
Hearing your comments, Brian, makes a couple of links in my mind that I'll share. And then Shanti, I want to see if you have anything to add before I do the share screen. Brian, you had mentioned this notion of burnout and also the visibility. And, one of the key kind of principles for us is designing, economic systems or systems of value exchange that really preserve the wholeness of individuals and the wholeness of systems. And part of that is to avoid burnout. And part of how we avoid burnout is by making these other realities visible. If we're pursuing financial capital or even financial and manufactured and human capital at the expense of psychological capital or spiritual capital or social capital, then we start to get an unbalanced system and people start just to be cogs in the wheel. But by having a system that allows us to see when the psychological capital is decreasing, people are getting burned out, they're getting frustrated, they're less engaged, right? Social connections are not strong. The cultural dimension is not vibrant. Then that can serve as a corrective to an overemphasis on some of the other capitals. So part of the beauty and power of this model and working with multiple kinds of capital is they start to be checks and balances against each other, so that you can start to see how an overfocus on some capitals are having an impact on the other capitals, right? And then you can better avoid burnout, and it's largely through making it visible. And one of the core principles around transformation, individually and collective, that comes out of the therapeutic traditions and the contemplative traditions is the importance of taking what's subject, something that you can't see that's kind of behind you, and bringing it around and making it an object of awareness. And so that's the visibility piece. By making these realities visible to us, then we can operate on them individually and collectively. In other words, we can bring our awareness to them, we can see them, then we can talk about them, we can then troubleshoot and figure out, all right, team participation's gone down a lot in the last 2 quarters. What do we do about it, right? How do we, engage that or shift that dynamic, right? So I think, we're experiencing collective burnout. Like the over focus on financial capital is killing us, right? It's like we are burned out individually and collectively. So I think that's part of what I love about this model, is it helps us kind of avoid that, and it does it largely through making these other realities visible. So Shanti, any comments before I do a share screen?
Sure. So 2 different quick tracks to bring into the conversation. And one is that there is a huge movement that's been building for decades, moving us towards multi-capitalism. And so, the triple bottom line, the new economy movement, conscious capitalism, and in the corporate sector, there's multiple entities that have been working towards this, and there's thousands of companies that are kind of grasping, wrestling with this, how do we do this, and working towards it. 3 of the overarching corporate sustainability bodies in the globe are coming together to do, like a whole initiative on publicizing and emphasizing the importance of multi-capitalism. And Sean has been asked to be on the board of that effort. And then, so from a completely different track, so me personally, I've lived in eco-villages for over about 10 years. And the way that these capitals can manifest in terms of a multi-capitalism can look completely different from what we currently experience in the world today. And just one quick example. So spirituality of a non-denominational nature was so important to one of these eco-villages. It was kind of weaved into the fabric of all the processes, the decisions, and anybody who came there could feel the palpable presence of kind of like this spiritual energy. And it was actually used in every single major decision, consciously used. So, it's not just about recreating the world in the model of financial capitalism spread to all these capitals. There's a lot of really innovative and exciting stuff going on all around the world, kind of like coming together. So.
Great. That's a perfect setup for me to then share the model and make a few points. So let me do that. All right, so can everyone see my desktop? Okay, I've left a couple things open because I'm going to switch between a few things. So here in kind of the foreground is the MetaImpact framework with its rainbow pie. And you see the 10 capitals are each of these slices of pie. And here you have the 4 types of impact that we talked about in the last conversation: the clear impact, high impact, wide impact, and deep impact. Now, each of these 4 types of impact are then measured through 2 or 3 types of capital. So we have health and human that go into clear impact. Manufactured, financial, and natural capital are all part of high impact. Social and cultural capitals are part of wide impact. And then knowledge, psychological, and spiritual capitals are part of deep impact. Now, when you look at the different models out there around that have more than one type of capital, you can find anywhere from models that have 3 or 4 types of capital all the way up to 19 types of capital. As I've talked about elsewhere, I essentially kind of did a big analysis of all of those, and kind of using integral theory as a framework, kind of landed on what I felt were the 10 most essential kinds of capital that are already talked about in the literature already have been operationalized into different types of reports, different types of metrics, different ways of engaging and documenting these realities through these different types of capital. You can also just refer to these as different domains or different values. You don't have to use the word capital. A lot of people who work with this framework are allergic to the notion of capital, and they want to use a different signifier, a different word for that, and that's absolutely fine. And then you can see here there's the first, second, and third person approaches to each of these capitals, right? So the different white kind of rings represent those sections, and we'll be discussing that in the next conversation. But then just to come over here to a slide that Shanti actually made, this gives you a sense of kind of the dramatic value of this model. So here on the far left, right, you have this little orange slice highlighted. So this is our current monocapitalistic system.
We can't see the current slide, Sean.
Oh, you can't? Okay, so let me stop sharing and then go back to sharing. Thank you for pointing that out. All right, can you see it now?
Yes.
Okay, good. So Shanti created this slide, and it's titled here From Monocapitalism to Thriving Multicapitalism. So here's our current system where we have an overfocus on third person, i.e. objective or interobjective, meaning systemic aspects of financial capital. So this is your basic kind of financial report, profit and loss and lines of credit and debt, how much cash you have in the bank, right? So that's the primary focus, even though some of the other capitals might be included to some extent in different situations. Then in the middle here, you have essentially what can be considered kind of the typical approach to a triple bottom line, where you include human capital and maybe even some health capital. You include manufactured capital and natural capital and even social and cultural capital. But you're still primarily including those and measuring those through a third person quantitative approach. And so this is a huge step forward over this version. As you can see, it's including 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 different types of capital in many respects. But then what we're really going for is this much more colorful version where you're including all 10 capitals, and not just from a third person perspective, but also an intersubjective or participatory approach and a first person or subjective experiential approach. So let me stop sharing there. I have a few more slides I'll show a little later that give some examples of different approaches and what capitals they focus on. But hopefully those 2 slides just kind of give you a little more idea of kind of what are the capitals we include. You don't need to include all of them. Claudia talked about the accordion aspect. So you can include 2, 3, 4. You can include 1 from each of the different types of impact for 4 total types of capital. You can really decide depending on what's most relevant for your project, your organization, kind of which capitals you include. And so there's a lot of flexibility with kind of expanding it or reducing it to really meet wherever you're at. So let me turn it back to all of you to see what questions or comments or examples that you might have around any of this questions. Yeah, Mary.
Sean, what occurred to me as you were sharing and also as you were speaking a little bit earlier is the focus that we currently have is not only figuratively but literally killing us.
Yeah.
And decades ago, Anais Nin mentioned that integration comes with maturity, and I have this sense that that's where we are wanting to head, is to a place of human maturity, so that we can address all of these things at all the different levels. Yeah. That's a thought that occurred to me as you were sharing and as I was reflecting on other things that you and other people have said.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely beautiful and really echoes what we're trying to do here in a couple of ways. One, we sometimes refer to this as a wisdom economy, right? And wisdom is maturity, right? So this sense that you have that it's about maturity, you're absolutely, and we have a long ways to go individually and collectively, right? But so it helps us set a stake in the ground of like, okay, this is what a mature, wise economic system of value exchange might look like. Like these are some of the elements we might consider in designing and creating those systems in our communities, in our organizations, you know, in our companies. And another part of that is you talked about integration, that maturity, often integration and maturity go together. Integration and wisdom go together, right? The more integrated we are, then the more mature and wise we are, because we're including more of reality in ourselves and in our interactions. One of the key pieces that comes before integration is differentiation. You have to differentiate before you can integrate. You have to create more parts before you can make a bigger whole, right? And so this is why the 10 capital model is really valuable, I believe, is because it helps us further differentiate, and then that enables us to then reintegrate at a higher octave. And the thing is, these 10 types of capital or 10 types of value are already recognized. They're already out there. They're already part of our relationships and our interactions. So in a way, it's not so much we need to differentiate into those 10 categories. Reality actually largely is already differentiated into those 10 categories. It's just our financial reporting process hasn't done a good job of actually including those other categories, right? And so by differentiating economy into these 10 types of value in the way that we're doing or similar approaches, then it allows us to be more consciously capable of integrating these different types of value in the systems, in the organizations, in the projects that we're working on, right? So this principle of differentiation and then integration, I think, is really crucial. And it's also why we differentiate into first, second, and third person. It's also why we differentiate impact into deep, clear, high, and wide, right? All of these are not to just create more jargon and to like, you know, like fill our head with concepts. It's to differentiate these important areas of like, what is impact? What is capital? You know, what is a bottom line, right? Differentiate these core concepts that are essential to financial systems, differentiate them enough and not over differentiate them, you know, so though 10 arguably might be more than, you know, is you know, really, you know, workable. But that's why we allow you to kind of choose, like, do I do 3 or 4 or 5, right? But it's like differentiating enough so that we can actually have the distinctions we need in order to have the conversations that have to happen in order to create these wise economies that serve the wholeness of individuals and the wholeness of systems. All right, a few other comments or questions, reflections. I'll just give a quick example why we're waiting for one of you to come forward with something. So just today, I got an email from some colleagues that are have a consultancy firm that focuses on impact, social impact. They're based in Montreal in Canada. And they are in the process of kind of establishing a contract with the city of Montreal to measure impact with a bunch of kind of innovative companies and organizations. And so they're developing this questionnaire that they'll use for these 1-hour interviews with the leaders of these different organizations. And so they're working with the MetaImpact framework to help inform the way they design and execute this questionnaire. And so I was going through it today, and I spent a couple hours looking at their questionnaire and then pointing out what types of capital, different questions and different kind of menus that they had included in the questionnaire included. And by and large, they did a great job of including the 10 capitals in most of the different sections. But it's really powerful for me going through it, and I'm curious to hear from them, when I get an email in the next day or so of like how that was to kind of see my, multi-capital analysis of what they did. But for me, in the process, like it was really striking to see how one, they had an inherent kind of orientation to wholeness. They largely included most forms of value or capital in what they were doing. But then by bringing the framework to bear on it, it felt like it was just fine-tuning it. It was giving it more of a surgical capacity to really zero in on some of the key elements. Because there were some sections where they really kind of left out natural capital. They left out psychological capital. And it felt like there could be some value in including 1 or 2 questions or elements in that section of the questionnaire that included those parts of reality, right? And so to me, this is like an example of how having this framework with its differentiations can help us take something that would work really well regardless, but then allows us to just fine tune it in a way that gives it even more kind of efficacy and traction. So we'll see how this collaboration continues, but just because it's so fresh, I thought I would just share that as one example of how using the 10 capitals can allow you to take something you're already doing and just take it to the next level.
One of the additional really exciting things about this, and so Sean and others from Meta Integral worked with a group of developers on an initial app that was going to implement a multi-capital kind of like tracking system, but being designed to basically raise the consciousness of everybody who used it. So when you design a system well and you're taking into account all these capitalism perspectives, you can design it so that every time somebody has an interaction with that, they are reinforcing kind of like the core values, the core principles, the whatever that may be. And in this case, it was a fellow who his main core value was oneness. And so like he infused oneness into the company's principles, and those are being infused into the software that'll be used on a daily basis by this company. And it's just a really transformative, conscious raising, amazing, powerful example of how this can be used. It's not just some dry accounting thinking, but on that note, when I was at the International Reporting 3.0 conference, there was a professor of accounting, and he said the vast majority of all like new PhD thesis that he had been involved with are basically moving into multi-capitalism. That's like historically like where he sees the whole accounting profession moving.
Yeah, great, Shanti. Those are good ads. I've noticed here that Jared, you posted a question, so I'll just kind of summarize that and also highlight that Jared's written a great article that uses a lot of the MetaImpact framework along with some other kind of integral models and approaches. So great to have you with us, Jared. And I believe, Jared, you're going to be in the course starting in February. So great to have you here tonight. So Jared's, pointing out in his comments in the chat room, which you can see for yourself, but he's basically highlighting that, in the approach to reporting that, if you compare kind of the standard approach to these types of reports, that a lot of the different domains that we include in our model are left out, right? So if you take the 10 capitals and you times that by 3, first, second, third person, you get 30 different kind of domains that you could include. And he's highlighting that, currently most of those are left out, and that's true. So our approach is to just support any form of multi-capitalism, however it shows up. And that's generally kind of the first step is going from a focus on financial capital to then including social, human, manufactured, and natural capital. Those are the most common forms of capital that most businesses are familiar with in one way or another. So if you can get their reporting to expand from an exclusive focus on financial to include some of those others, even if it's primarily through a third person modality, then that's fine. That's a step in the right direction. And then you can help them see some of the other types of capital that they're not including, such as psychological or knowledge or health, and then help them include those in a third person sense. And then eventually, as they get more capable of including those different capitals in their third person expressions, in their reports, in their organization, kind of in their feedback loops, then you can help expand it into some second or first person aspects, right? But it's a process, and you kind of have to be really skillful, meet people where they're at, meet organizations where they're at, not expect things to change too fast, too quickly, generally. And just slowly kind of start filling in more and more of the pie, right? So like if you saw that image that Shanti had created, right, where we went from the one yellow mark to 6 colors filled in to then all of it, right? So then you kind of get a sense of how an organization might slowly begin to color in more and more of those pieces of the Meta Integral framework. And with that in mind, let me just now do a screen share to show a couple of the charts I have here that kind of make that point, and then we'll come back to the group discussion. All right, so the first one is an example of kind of a stereotypical view of nonprofits versus for-profits. So for-profits generally emphasize the third-person aspects of these forms of capital. So natural capital, financial capital, manufactured capital, human capital, and health capital, right? They don't always include health, but sometimes they do. But at any rate, they generally really emphasize the third-person objective dimensions of those types of value. Whereas nonprofits, generally mission-driven organizations and nonprofits generally really include more of a participatory approach. And they tend to emphasize the spiritual in terms of vision, mission, psychological in terms of psychological well-being, emotional maturity, capacity, empowerment, sense of safety, knowledge, the transfer of knowledge, institutional knowledge, sharing of knowledge, and then social connections and cultural backgrounds and community dynamics, right? So they tend to emphasize more the second person aspects of these capitals. So you can see how, the nonprofits, can really benefit from including more of these types of capital, and the for-profits, and the conscious capitalism efforts can really include and do well to include more of, these types of capital. Of course, that is a, kind of a stereotypical approach, and any given organization is going to look a little different, but that's just to kind of highlight, some of the, general dynamics. Now, if we look at, this is an organization that I'm working with, and we're developing software, different software than the software that Shanti was just talking about. This is a forklift company, Internet of Things company, based in Australia, but they're international. And this is just highlighting the forms of capital they generally highlight, and which is the dark ones, and then some of the forms of capital they're starting to include and emphasize more, right? So here again, you can see this point that I was making of, you slowly just start expanding and coloring in some of the blank areas and figuring out ways to include practices or measurements or KPIs in each of these. And it can take 5 to 10 years before, you have all of this filled in. And the striped sections are kind of informal approaches to those capital, and then the solid ones are more formal ones that are being included in the annual report, in a sense. And then let me just, I basically made that point before, so I'll leave it at that. All right, so let's hear from a few more folks. We have about 10 more minutes. We want to use a couple minutes at the end for Shanti to just share a few things about wrapping up and next steps. So additional comments, reflections, questions? Brian, let me wait on you just a second to see if Eric or Court, or Runa, someone who hasn't spoken, wants to share a little bit. Court, can I call on you? Anything you want to share with us? Nope, I'm trying to unmute you. You'll have to unmute yourself.
Okay.
There you go.
Am I unmuted?
Yep,
yes.
We got
Okay, I'm coming in as a stranger, Sean, in the sense that I haven't been involved with you directly, but I am seeing what you are attempting to do here as a wonderful extension of prior things that you've done in ecology, prior things that obviously that have come out of Integral General and from Ken Wilber in particular. And I'm both excited and trying to figure out if I really, at my age, have anything that I can offer in a group like this, which I sense is already deep. Most of the folks in this group, I sense, are deeply involved in ongoing projects, which I am not. I am deeply involved emotionally, spiritually, and intellectually in, hoping to make the world a better place, particularly in ecological and economic terms. But whether I can add anything, my concern is, can I really add anything to a group that I sense is already so far ahead of me?
Right.
So you don't have to respond to that, by the way. Just It's just a concern. That's where I'm coming from. Thank you.
Yeah, Shanti, you want to respond?
That's beautiful and amazing that you're wanting to make the world a better place. And one of the things that's really profound about this framework is that somebody who's not an expert in any capitals or not an expert in anything can kind of learn to kind of like breathe this in and integrate it into their life. And one of the key things that happens is what I call the hammer syndrome. So you get a bunch of experts in the room and they each think they're an expert on something, and all they see is what they're the expert in. So if you're a hammer, all you ever see is nails, and so if you're an allopathic doctor, all you ever see is, something to give shots or cut out, or, for example. And it's actually essential to have people who don't have that attachment or expertise focus to look at the bigger picture in a group like this and say, hey, wait a minute, this doesn't make sense. Can you kind of explain it to me? And in even asking that question and forcing the group to look at something that you don't understand can often bring in new insight that these experts with their hammer thinking would totally have washed right over.
Well, I appreciate the response, Shanti, but and part of that is this is part of my uncertainty is that there are so many different scales that people are functioning at and commenting at and acting at. And because I am not immediately currently involved in a project, in an enterprise, in a company, in an organization, my sense is that most of the dialogue and interest is coming from folks that are, my concern is much more philosophical and global, if you will, which, okay, that's okay, but it's at a completely different scale or level. And they're both, they both have their place. I'm concerned about the energy, and I don't want to detract from the energy and dynamics that comes from folks who are, immediately involved in trying to make a better project or organization. That's the thing. Anyway, enough.
Yeah,
that's perfect.
Carry on.
So we had a 5-day Meta Integral seminar in Iceland.
Yeah, and I wish I'd been there, but I couldn't.
And so there was a segment of the people who were there who were really passionate about Integral, really passionate about the MetaImpact framework, but had no project. And so they just applied the framework to their life and how they're trying to move their life in a more transcendent direction, and they had really profound experiences and insights that they gave to the whole group by applying it to their personal level, not just to like a project or an organization. Okay. And I'm gonna take that as a launching point so we can finish up on time. I just put a link for the 5-day Australia seminar that we're gonna have in about a year, next year. It's going to be amazing, and any of you are welcome to join. Before that, we're going to have, and that's going to be a really deep dive into applying the MetaImpact framework, both in the context of the aged healthcare system in Australia. We have people in the field that are really doing some amazing, innovative stuff, but also applying it to any business, personal, or project context. But we're going to have a very exciting 10-day master course that's virtual. You don't have to travel anywhere. You get to work closely with Sean and myself and Claudia over 10 live virtual modules with additional content provided. And the early bird registration deadline for that is next week on November 21st. So the price will be going up after the 21st. And we did a master course a couple of years ago. This is the second iteration. We're improving it. And the people in that first course every one of them got so much out of it. And some of them were already heavily engaged in associated projects, and some of them had no idea what any of this was about, and both got a tremendous amount from it and really helped the group with their inputs. So we really invite you to join us for the online master course starting in February. We encourage you to sign up next week, save yourself a little bit of money. Those, I think, were the two announcements I needed to make, right, Sean? Oh, and the last one more really quick. So there was some great stuff that came out of this call today. We really appreciate everybody being on the call. It wouldn't have been a productive call without your comments and questions. Our call number 3 is going to be on using integral data to measure what matters. How can we tell more powerful stories about the impact we're having? That's going to be on December 18th from 2 to 3 US Pacific, the same time. So I invite you to join again at that time.
Great.
And I'll hand it back over to you, Deshaun, to wrap up.
Yeah, thank you, Shanti. And I'll just use that announcement about the next conversation to answer Eric's question that he posted in the chat, where he's asking about, what's the resistance to these ideas? And generally, there's very little resistance to the notion of, deep, clear, high and wide impact. Like, people generally really like that, and they see the value of those distinctions. Generally, people really like the idea of multiple capitals, and they like the fact they can, still cling to their third-person objective approach. They don't have to give that up if they don't want to. So more resistance kind of occurs when we get into the next conversation around first, second, and third-person data, because it's at that point in the model where we start bumming up to people's mental models, the scientific orientation, kind of what counts as true and real and valid. And so that's when we start to have kind of more of what you might call the resistance, or more questions or unclarity around what really counts as a metric. What is data? How do we use data? Can the same data set be used to support first, second, and third person types of data out of that data set, right? So it's more at that point, because it's at that point we're kind of the devil in the details, right? We're getting into the specifics in such a way that people's assumptions and preferences start coming forward in a way where then you're kind of dealing more with some of the resistance. If not the resistance, more like the concern of like, how do I make this work in my company? How do I make, my board of directors sign on to this? How do I include this in the final report? How do I include this in the quarterly reviews, right? So when you really get into the different metrics and how they might fall into different types of data, then it's like a whole new layer of kind of juicy conversation, opens up. So tune back, next month as we dive into that, and we can kind of spend more time getting into some of the resistances that occur at that point and how we can overcome those. So thank you all for joining. Great to see you. Hope to see you next time. And Claudia will send out the link so that folks can share it and watch sections of it again. So have a great rest of your day and a good weekend coming up.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.
Bye, everyone.